Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. We're pleased to be joined by a very special guest today, former U.S. Attorney General Mr. Edwin Meese, an advisor to President Ronald Reagan before becoming his Attorney General. Mr. Meese was a member of the Cabinet and the National Security Council. Mr. Meese currently holds the Ronald Reagan Chair for Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation and is also chairman of Heritage's Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. And Mr. Meese, thanks so much for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
President Obama, in a press conference today, pressed Congress to raise the debt ceiling without any strings or spending cuts. Some House Republicans are ready to test the limits of defaulting on the nation's debt in order to force spending cuts from the president. Should the GOP let the government default or shut it down altogether?
Well, I think it's important that action be taken to curb the unusual and unprecedented degree of spending, particularly spending which has no revenue to offset it, and which is merely driving up our deficits and in turn the national debt. Under this president, we have had an unprecedented amount of excess spending, and as a result of this, the national debt has gone from, I believe it was $10 trillion when he took over as president, and is now something in excess of $16 trillion. More deficit spending than any president in history. As a matter of fact, it's more than the first 41 presidents all put together. So I think something has to be done, and probably the right thing to do would be to put together a package which would increase the debt ceiling only as much as there are spending cuts to offset it. To just let the president go ahead and raise the debt ceiling so he could continue this deficit spending is kind of like giving your kid a credit card without any limitations whatsoever.
The president today warned against what he described as the potentially catastrophic effect on the economy by tying cuts to raising the debt ceiling. Do you think the president is serious about debt reduction?
Well, obviously, when he says things like that, he's not serious. If he were serious, he would have a plan to try to at least put us on a path which would reduce the deficits over a period of time, so that even if it took a number of years, we would ultimately get the budget back into balance. But to just have unrestrained spending, such as he is advocating, and just borrowing the money in order to support this unrestrained spending is certainly the kind of a folly that we've been involved in the last 4 years, and this would only make it much worse.
Mr. Meese, let's turn to gun control. President Obama today said he'd take executive action to deal with guns. In your view, does this amount to an out-of-control power grab, and is the president overreaching on gun control?
Well, I think it's hard to tell until and unless we get some specific actions that he proposes to take. But I think it should be remembered that the president cannot, by executive order, do things which affects the public at large unless there is some congressional basis for it. In other words, some congressional authority that he has been given. An executive order without specific congressional authority can only apply to those portions of the government that are under his control, in other words, the executive branch. Now, there are some things in which he can probably do in regard to the actions of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or some other governmental agency in its operations, but to impose burdens or regulations that affect society generally, he would have to have congressional authorization.
So if the president unilaterally overrides the Second Amendment via executive order, I mean, would this be constitutional? Would it be legal? And how should Congress respond?
Well, it would not be legal. It would not be constitutional. And indeed, if he tried to override the Second Amendment in any way, I believe it would be an impeachable offense.
So what should Congress do then?
Then it would be up to the Congress to take action, such as looking into it to see if in fact he has really tried to override the Constitution itself, in which case then it would be up to them to determine what action they should take, and perhaps even to the point of impeachment.
All right, well, we'll be watching this one closely.
Yes, indeed.
Next week, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will hold hearings into the September 11th attack at Benghazi that killed 4 Americans, including Ambassador Chris Stevens. What do you believe these hearings will show? And should Eric Holder have appointed a special prosecutor to investigate the attack?
Well, I don't believe that there's any reason for a special prosecutor, inasmuch as it appears that this whole episode was the result of poor leadership, poor planning, poor response. But as far as any criminal act involved, I don't know that anyone has alleged that that is true. I think it is up to the committee, though, to find out what happened and to find out who is responsible, because it was certainly appears, at least at some level, to be dereliction of duty, or at the very least poor judgment.
Attorney General Eric Holder is remaining in the Obama administration as it enters its second term. How do you think he's done these past 4 years?
Well, I've followed the basic policy of my predecessors and my successors, and that is that one Attorney General does not try to evaluate what another Attorney General has done, largely because unless you're actually there and have all the facts, it's pretty hard to do that. So I would really not comment on his performance. There have been some things that have happened within the Department of Justice, such as the refusal to provide information to the Congress on this Fast and Furious, and a number of things along those lines that I think are serious problems, and that's up to the Congress really to utilize its prerogatives under the Constitution to find out more about them.
Mr. Meese, what do you make of the President's nominations of John Brennan for CIA Director, Chuck Hagel for Defense Secretary, and John Kerry for Secretary of State? And what do these nominations tell us about the course that the President is taking with his foreign policy in his second term?
Well, I think that it does tell us one thing in the nomination of Senator Kerry. Here is a man who gave aid and comfort to the enemy during the Vietnam War. I think it's a very poor appointment or nomination. I think also what he has done over his career has not indicated any ability really to guide a department which is one of our most important elements of foreign policy. So I would have serious concerns about that particular appointment. As for other appointments, I don't really know enough about the record of the other two gentlemen to give a total assessment, but I do think that all of them ought to be seriously questioned by the appropriate committees, because there's no more important element of our entire government than our national security policy, and these are the three key positions in terms of providing that leadership. Up to date, we have had some very good people in those positions, but we have had a serious, I would say, deficiencies in terms of the President's overall foreign policy, particularly in regard to Israel. So I think this is an opportunity for the Congress, particularly the Senate in this case, to exercise its responsibilities and to look at the overall national security policies of this President, and on that basis find out whether his overall policies and whether these particular leaders are qualified to provide that kind of work, that kind of service to the country in the future.
President Obama is now finishing his first term. How do you view his federal judge appointments? Have they been quality picks or liberal ideologues? And what do you expect in Obama's second term?
I think that primarily many of the judge picks, and of course there's a lot of selection, a lot of nominations throughout the federal judiciary. And I would say that I don't think there are too many of them that I would call unusually distinguished. But in terms of the Supreme Court appointment, I would say they're more liberal ideologues than they are distinguished jurists.
What about Justice Roberts? He voted to uphold Obamacare, breaking with conservatives. Were you surprised by that decision, and do you think that Roberts will continue to be the maverick on the court?
Well, I wouldn't call him a maverick based upon one particular instance. I was surprised, certainly, but I prefer to think of this as an aberration, because overall, in most of the cases that in which he's decided cases, or particularly been a principal author of a decision, I think he's done very well. That's why I was so surprised to see this departure from sound decision-making in the Obamacare case.
Let's turn to immigration, Mr. Meese. Senator Marco Rubio is developing an immigration reform plan that includes steps to give more than 12 million illegals currently in the U.S. legal status. His plan is similar to the president's in that it creates a process in which undocumented workers can gain status and create a potential path to citizenship. Do you see Senator Rubio's ideas getting broad support from the GOP?
Well, I think we have to see the actual plans first. My understanding of what he had proposed was not exactly the same as you've described, but I think until we actually see a plan with all the details, it would be hard really to make a judgment. I have a lot of confidence in Senator Rubio generally. He's been an outstanding senator. He believes in basic principles of our democracy. He believes certainly in the rule of law. So I'd have to see the exact proposals before making a judgment. I also think that in as complex a subject as immigration, it may be better to put 3 or 4 or perhaps even more different proposals before the Congress rather than to have them in one sweeping bill which would cover so much that it would be very hard for any particular member of Congress to vote for all of the proposals. And so maybe it's necessary to put a series of bills before the Congress rather than have one omnibus bill, but have it perhaps all part of a general plan, but a plan that conforms to the rule of law.
Mr. Meese, you served with Colin Powell in the Reagan administration, and this weekend he said the GOP has an identity crisis. After losing 2 consecutive presidential elections with eroding support among Latinos and unmarried women, and with Republicans in the House divided on key issues, can the party rebound, and if so, how?
Well, I think the party has always rebounded from situations like this. There were many decades that we had a Democratic majority in both houses, let alone in one house. And there were also a period of time from the early 30s through actually all the way into the 1950s when the presidency was in Democrat hands. So I think that they certainly have the ability to rebound. I think that the one mistake they would make is if they tried to be like Democrats light and tried to mimic the Democrats, because I don't think that's either good government nor good politics, because I don't think that's what the public wants.
All right, former Attorney General Edwin Meese, thanks for being with us today. It's always an honor to have you with us on Newsmax TV.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.